I didn't mention Pittsburgh, but their pass rate over expected was a season high. 15th overall, not a lot of air yards, very low ADOT, a lot of underneath throws. Even the touchdown to Pickens was a wide receiver screen. It seemed like that was the game plan against the Bengals, was to beat them with short passing. I think it was 13 pass attempts to the running backs. All of them were completed. And then Pat Freiermuth has like another 7 catches out of low ADOT from the tight end position. Just a fascinating week, because the other stat I didn't talk about on the other side, Sean, was the rush attempts, which is also obviously interrelated. So Tennessee's a team I didn't mention. They were way up there in pass rate, in part because they got behind really early, but also had a lot of air yards. They only ran 11 total rush attempts, including quarterback rushes. That was tied for the fewest in the NFL this year in a game. The Dolphins only had 14. They more or less have given up on the running game, but that is not really bad for Achane. They're going to throw to him 9, 10 times, 11 times a game. They only had 14 carries. Minnesota, Cincinnati, Chicago all had 15. That's 5 teams, Sean, that were all in the top 10 or bottom 10 in rush attempts in the game this season. And then Kansas City only had 16, to go back to them. They barely ran the ball in this game. The Chargers, who we mentioned, had very few plays, only had 17 rush attempts. Bunch of teams with very, very few rush attempts. We're talking bottom, 20, 30 outcomes of the entire NFL season. That also played in to this week with some of these pass-heavy outcomes. And then the one team that I haven't mentioned that was a total enigma is the Colts, where they finished with one of the lowest pass rates over expected in the entire season. It was the 7th lowest, minus 20%. And yet they had the 31st most air yards, because they had the second highest ADOT by any team in the league. You won't be surprised to learn that the first highest ADOT was a previous Indianapolis Colts game. They only threw 24 passes, but when they did, they chucked him down the field. Anthony Richardson isn't going to throw a lot, but when he does, it's going to be bombs. So even for them, by their standards, this was a very Colts type of game. A lot of volume still by their standards, not a lot of hits. And Richardson, actually, because he didn't hit on those deep shots, missed Mitchell on the one, or Mitchell drops it. Kylan Granson has a chance on one, doesn't catch it. Alec Pierce gets some deep shots that don't connect. He winds up with only like 100 pass yards in this game. And then, yet,
again, to kind of excuse our consistent and blatantly devastating QB selections / misses, Anthony Richardson threw the ball 24 times for 109 passing yards. One of the things that we've been kind of talking about, I think, off the show is that, he's going to complete between 10 and 12 passes in the game. There is a huge amount riding on those passes, and everything that Anthony Richardson does is almost exactly like that Xavier Worthy issue, where if those passes hit, things can be fine. If they don't, you're looking at nothing. And then on top of that, when we talk about these passes the QBs have missed, but the thing that you're emphasizing there, and that was such a huge blow to their offense in this game, when he made the passes, the Mitchell drop, the Granson one, not good either, but they miss Josh Downs in a huge way. I thought that between Pittman and Mitchell, and then with Pierce actually playing pretty well as a deep threat, that this offense was kind of covered vertically. And that one of the reasons that Downs was a tricky play this season is that he would be used a little bit more underneath. And that's not where, at this point, they understand Richardson can't make those throws, so they just simply don't even have him in the offense. The thing that has become very clear, and one of the reasons why I do push back in some situations, because I think you have to look at it player by player. When people are talking about ADOT traveling with the receiver, and that you have to understand that this is what a receiver is, there is still an element where different offenses are going to need different things and are use players differently. Josh Downs is just the best receiver that they have by far at every depth and in every possible way. And when they don't have him out there, then you have things like guys actually dropping the handful of accurate passers. The Colts should have lost this game. And you could even make an argument that Anthony Richardson played pretty well.
And what's so fascinating is even with the 100 yards, he still has a really nice fantasy day, because he's getting the design runs that we weren't getting necessarily early in the year because they were worried about hurting him. They're less worried about it at this point after his rocky season. 48 rushing yards and a rush TD. He does get 2 pass TDs, which is a big part of why he winds up with a good day. Despite the 109 pass yards, he gets a couple pass TDs. And then he runs for the 2-point conversion at the very end where they decide to go for it. They get it. They win. Walk-off victory on the road, more or less. You get a rushing TD.
I don't remember specifically now if it was after the touchdown or after the 2-point conversion. I believe it was after the 2-point conversion, but definitely correct me if I'm wrong. The most athletic thing I've seen from the most athletic player in the NFL was his victory snap after the rushing score.
Oh, the victory snap.
No, sorry.
The spike. The spike that he did after the score. Yeah.
Right.
That was incredible. The 360 spike.
He was in the air for half an hour.
Yeah. He got all the way around and spiked it and was still hovering. And I'm like,
when the ball's like crossing back over his head.
Yeah, that was insane. I noticed that too. After he scores that, he jumps out of the building to do a 360 spike. I've never seen anyone try a 360 and so clearly finish the full 360 before even like descending, where he's still so clearly above. If that was a dunk, he was doing a 360 and then throwing it off the backboard to himself and then still catching it and dunking it. There was so much time after he did the whole thing. He could have done a 720. I mean, that was insane. That was the most athletic thing of the week. I know that immediately jumped out to me too, and exactly what you're talking about. That was bonkers. Yeah, he's the most athletic dude in the league. I agree with you on that. And he winds up with a great fantasy day, as we were saying, despite basically no completions the entire game. That final drive, he completes the majority of his passes, I think, for the game. But then you get the design runs. You get all these other things. Looks like he had 4 completions on that final drive, and he had 12 on the game. So not the majority, but 8 completions leading into that. And he finishes with 109 yards. So he had fewer than 100 leading into that final drive. He's an enigma for sure, but you're going to get the rushing. You're going to get a little bit of a floor there. You obviously have the ceiling situation. But yeah, Shawn, a wild game. The other team I didn't mention, by the way, was the Cardinals. So 14 different teams. Cardinals had 45 pass attempts, mostly driven by the fact that they had 76 total plays, mostly just a situation where they had the ball a lot in that game. Their defense gave the Vikings some fits, but it was a season high for them in pass attempts by 8. Some of these teams were the pass volume was driven by the game. Tennessee, for example, fell behind, heavy trail script early, but some of them, it was fascinating to see, Pittsburgh in double-digit positive pass rate over expected, to see how aggressive Miami was willing to get with only 14 rushes all game. They're just like, we're going to pass every single play. You had said to me, as we were talking about the Tua start sit, that they're throwing in the red zone a ton now too, and they end up doing that in this game. They tried Achane once on 2nd and goal. He gets stuffed, and they go, we're going to throw on 3rd and 4th from the 1. We're not going to try to run again. We can't QB sneak because we can't get our QB a hit to the head. They threw on 3rd and 4th. They got stuffed in the situation. They got back down there later. They threw again, and they throw a touchdown later. That's great for Tua's pass TD rate, which is something that you've mentioned to me. There are several exciting elements to the different pass games that are seemingly just finally starting to open it up when the weather's turning bad and all of these things. It'll be exciting to see where the league goes in these next couple of weeks, because I don't think this is all going to stick. This is probably just a little bit of a variance, week where things swung back toward, back toward the pass. One of the things I was thinking is you had several of these teams coming off week 12 buys. So maybe they were just doing something right before the bye. And you had teams like Houston going into the bye. Maybe they wanted to do something right before the bye. The other teams coming off the bye, like Cincinnati, Jacksonville, coming out of the bye with more aggressive game plans. Denver, another team that was aggressive going into their bye. Maybe the fact that there were 6 buys in week 12 and 6 buys in week 14 played into this a little bit. I don't know. But week 13, wild week.
Ben, you haven't talked a lot about Seahawks, Jets. Do you have takeaways for us for this one? It was a lot of fun that the Seahawks, who needed the win, do get the victory, but their offense looked bad. It was only the 4.7 yard per attempt performance from Aaron Rodgers and the consistent fumbles from Breece Hall that allowed them to get over the line with Kenneth Walker again, running sideline to sideline.
Yeah, 259 total yards, 258 for the Jets. That was my key stat in stealing signals, was like, this just wasn't a very fun game. It was a game that there was supposedly some wind going into the game. I didn't check and hear or whatever how bad the wind was. It didn't seem to affect them too much, but yet the offenses did struggle. So, it's tough to say. It was a crazy first half, right? The Jets had a kick return touchdown. Seattle had a pick six. Seattle fumbled 2 different kickoff returns, lost them both. Both teams had an extra point blocked. I mean, there was just an insane element here. New York builds a big lead because they're getting all these short fields off the fumbled kick returns, and they end up getting their own kick return touchdown. And yet they kind of blew that, and Seattle was able to come back. Seattle looked like the much better team, frankly, over the course of the game. If you try to control for some of these wacky events that occurred, the pick six, I mean, that was wild. Aaron Rodgers misses a wide open Garrett Wilson, who's running a little sluggo of a fake in and out to the corner, and completely gets his defender to break hard in. And then when he goes out, he's wide, and Rodgers throws it out of bounds. And then the next play, Rodgers tries to force it to Garrett Wilson because he was so mad at himself. You can see after the play, he's hitting himself in the head and all this. Very next play, he tries to throw a slant to Garrett Wilson and throws a pick six to a defensive lineman who's dropping into the pass lane. I thought the Jets were the same as they've been. They're just not a good team for fantasy right now. It's horrible. They don't win enough plays. They make games less fun, etc. I thought Seattle was a little bit more the victim of the scenario, the wind, maybe a long travel to a 10 a.m. body clock game, if you will, on the road. They were talking about that on the broadcast and saying that the Seahawks finally did, that they hadn't come alive in the first half, and that's why there were so many of these wacky plays, the fumbled kickoffs, and they finally come alive in the second half. The one exciting note I have for you, because the Kenneth Walker stuff wasn't great. DK Metcalf got a lot of volume, but wasn't really necessarily hitting 4 catches on 9 targets. One vaguely exciting note I have for you is JSN. Kind of a quiet game, but he has 4 catches for 74 yards, and he had 3 catches of 20-plus yards downfield. We talked last week, all of his stuff was the low ADOT, but we've talked about how he's been able to perform at all depths. So in this matchup, there's not a lot of short stuff. It seemed to me, they didn't even really try it. It seemed to me like they felt, and I complimented Ryan Grubb in my write-up on this, that they felt like it was so obviously going to be on film, and the Jets would have game planned for the short JSN stuff, that they weren't going to even go to it. They were just going to make a different plan instead of like, let's see if they can stop it. They're like, look, we'll just make a completely different plan. We'll work a different direction. They did try one quick screen to JSN in the second half eventually, and the Jets were all over it. And again, JSN has been putting this on film every week and making big plays on these wide receiver screens. So instead they had JSN running a lot of downfield routes, but he does end up having the 3 receptions of 20-plus yards. So it's not a huge day for him, but 4 catches for 74 yards in a game where both teams didn't even have 260 total yards of offense. And particularly, it seemed like the Jets, whether from a matchup perspective or just the way that the Seahawks game planned, were not going to be giving up a lot of the short stuff, or Seattle wasn't going to go for the short stuff, however you want to look at that, that JSN was able to come through with 3 downfield catches. I thought was at least a little bit entertaining, at least a little bit exciting.
Definitely, if you're not going to get the target volume that he's gotten in so many games, you want it to be down the field. That did bail out fantasy managers, at least to an extent. Still a lot better to get a score in the 10 range than in the 1 or 2 range. The results for Kenneth Walker, I think, have been absolutely crazy when you consider that he's still actually above average FPOE on the year. But one of the things that we talk about a decent amount is that you want to chase talent for a variety of reasons. It increases the moat, it increases the volume, it increases the chance for the types of big plays that we've gotten from Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry, James Cook. The Cook one is interesting. I kind of mentioned that earlier in the show. He has 3 different games this season with at least 9 fantasy points over expected, including week 13. I mean, Saquon is at 7.6 for the season. Derrick Henry is at 6.3. As I was writing it up this week, I mean, Saquon has 5 different games, 5 completely separate games in which he has at least 14 fantasy points over expected. We know that Joe Mixon is having a good season. We know that the Texans are leaning into him. To give you context on those 5 games with at least 14 fantasy points over expected, Joe Mixon has 18 fantasy points over expected for his entire career. Josh Jacobs has only 1 season with at least 20 fantasy points over expected. Najee Harris has more seasons where he is at least 10 points below expected, which is 3, than seasons with positive, which is 0. In 63 career games, he has 1 game with double-digit fantasy points over expected. This one is maybe not even that helpful from a context perspective because it's so many games and such a Hall of Fame type of player. But what Barkley is consistently doing is more similar to me to what Adrian Peterson did in a lot of games. And one of the things that's so frustrating if you maybe have Barkley and you're thinking, well, he could be at 30 points per game for the season, is that Barkley is a fantastic receiver. Adrian Peterson was not, but Barkley doesn't really catch passes, although he is leading the position in air yards. But over the first 149 games of Adrian Peterson's career, he had 21 games with double-digit FPOE, which obviously is a lot. Over his final 34, he had 0. So I bring all of that up to set up Kenneth Walker, who is on a bit of a bad stretch, but evaded 5 more tackles in this game. He was hit at the line on 9 of his 16 carries and stuffed 6 times. He did lose important high-value touches to Charbonnet. That was a huge bummer. But you look back over this recent stretch, which has been really poor. Starting in week 8, he has played 5 games. Every single one has been in the negative. He has a game with minus 7.8, minus 3.7, minus 2.9. This week was minus 10. He's averaging almost 5 points below expected over this 5-game span. Then Kenneth Walker leads the NFL in evasion rate. This isn't one where we go back and say, well, you drafted a bad player or there's an injured player the fact that Kenneth Walker can be putting up those FPOE numbers while being the most evasive running back in the entire NFL, well, part of it goes back to that thing of you do at some point have to run forward. And, maybe that's something he still needs to work on, but it's also a deal where the Seahawks run blocking grades from SIS are not just like through the floor. They're like somewhere down in the Earth's core. Very, very bad. I don't even know that Kenneth Walker is startable this week. Again, if you have a good team, but his metrics are absolutely bizarre. You just don't see this kind of thing where a player is in some key metrics performing so well, but then on a per touch basis, he's actually doing very objectively poor. I was going to say he's getting poor results in terms of what we want for fantasy.
So he had about a 30-yard TD called back to holding. I don't know if you mentioned that, but he did have, right? Did I make that up? I have that in my notes. Got stuffed on 2 green zone touches. Charbonnet got the TD in the green zone on a play where he was a motion man decoy.
That was a very well-designed play. And exactly as they were running it, I was thinking, don't run such a well-designed play, or if you do, make it to our guy.
Well, so that's the thing is, he was a very effective decoy. And I wonder if that gets to why he's had some trouble because, we do know he can run laterally, but teams are like, look, we just got to keep this guy near the line of scrimmage because we know that when he gets in space, he's so explosive. I took a screenshot and put it in Stealing Signals this week, Sean. I'm going to share it with you on our recording. And for anyone who, I don't know, might be watching on YouTube, if we still put these up on YouTube, I have no idea. But this is what I put in Signals, Sean. It is right at the handoff. You have Walker was motioning. There's the offensive line's kind of blocking to Walker's side as well, but there's 3 defensive linemen moving that way. Both of the second level defenders are staring at Kenneth Walker. And Charbonnet is getting a handoff straight up the middle where there's just no players. It's vacated, basically.
I don't think I've ever seen a green zone run play where 0 defenders went with the halfback who was lined up to take the handoff.
Right. It's a straight ahead handoff. And you're seeing at the point of the handoff, it was wild. How many players their attention was on Kenneth Walker. And like I said, it was an effective decoy is the way that worked out. So I don't know that he was losing touches to Charbonnet as much as it was a well-designed play. Like you said, you're like, look, we can't get him in. They tried him twice earlier and they couldn't get him in. I do still think the team is like, Kenneth Walker's our best player. We want to get him the ball, all those things. I don't think they're putting it on him that this inefficiency's been there. I don't think he's losing work or any of that stuff. I do still think the big play is going to come. And all you really need is the explosive play. And the rest of the usage is pretty strong. I feel like it's just one of those things where you have guys run bad for periods of time sometimes. It's, I was talking a little bit ago about these like percentile outcomes. Like I feel like he's just been hitting floor outcome after floor outcome. And you say over the last 4 or 5 weeks, whatever it is, he's at like his 15th percentile outcome in terms of what he should be giving us. There's not a lot you can do about it, right? Like they're going to continue to try and find ways to get him going. And at least we're not losing the work is the thing that I think is exciting.
Yeah, the only other additional tiny little negative note I would put in there is that according to our streamer, he also does have one of the tougher schedules remaining. So we could be looking at 2025 before things bounce back with the Seahawks. One of the notes that I have had for subscribers recently, however, is that I've been very impressed with what the Seahawks have done, in part, even just going back to that play you just described. And I think that they have the right brain trust in place to address their weaknesses. I think that you will see a team that grows over the last month. I think you will see a team that makes smart offseason moves. And I think you see a team that is going to really light the world on fire in 2025.
That, definitely seems plausible enough to me. I'm trying to find this play where I said he had a 30-yard TD called back by penalty in the game log, and I'm not seeing it. I had it in my notes. I don't know what I was thinking. Do you remember that play? I don't remember the play is the reason that I'm...
No, I don't. I was kind of looking through as well. I'm not seeing it. He's had that happen several times. It could have been one of the way I set my notes up are vestiges of previous weeks.
The other really exciting player we haven't gotten to yet this week, Sean, is Bucky Irving, who went absolutely bananas. Our favorite player. We joked all offseason that sort of when in doubt, we would draft Bucky Irving whenever we were on the clock on whatever teams we were doing. We had a lot of Bucky Irving on our co-managed teams. Fun week for the Bucky Irving stands. 185 yards on 28 touches, a TD. Sean Tucker does not touch the ball in this game. We've talked about the sort of saga of the Bucs backfield. I mentioned last week they've led the NFL in team high value touches, and so you start to get the concentration now element as well. The running back position is valuable here. We broke down the Bucs last week and how Bucky took over from Rashad coming out of the bye in week 12, and Rashad got a lot of his work in week 12 late in the game. But now that, Tucker had that bad fumble, we talked about he had this goal line roll right at the beginning of week 12, and then he loses it with that fumble, and now he's just out of the equation. There's still a little bit of room for Rachaad White. The snaps were close to 50-50, but White only has 12 touches. Bucky Irving gets 28, and I think it was like 53-47 in favor of Bucky, the snaps, whatever it was. I don't have it in front of me. It was closer than that. Clear intent to have Bucky as the lead player in this backfield. Now, he does seem a little bit banged up. He's playing through a hip thing, Sean. But, he's just so good. He's so much fun to watch. He's taking short passes and making a guy miss and finding space. He's taking runs and making the guy miss and finding space. The way I wrote it up in Signals was you hear these guys talk in the broadcast booth and watching games about how a lot of the play run designs are designed to get the running back into the hole where he has to make one guy miss and then he's gone. You get everything else blocked up. Make that one guy miss. That's the running back's job. Make one guy miss in space. Bucky always makes the one guy miss, and then you get to see him go run to space, right? And it's a very, very fun way for those things to go. He is so good at evading the tackles And their offense right now, and the way they set things up is they do create space. Even Rachaad White can have long runs. He has a 38-yard run in overtime that sets up the game-winning field goal in a really fun overtime game between the Bucs and the Panthers. The Panthers continue to look a lot more fun lately. But yeah, the Bucs backfield, very, very valuable, and Bucky's the one earning it all right now. We talked about him last week. You had him like 10th overall as where he should be rest of season. Where is he now? I mean, is he at the very top?
Ben, he's been unbelievable. When I did a kind of fun little exercise. I kind of contrasted it with the ones that you and I have done. And I put the link in there for Stealing Bananas in the intro. So it shouldn't be behind the paywall. Anybody who just wants to find that show where we talk about 2025 projected ADP. I went ahead and did my own way too early rankings, and he's in the second round, which still feels weird to me based on being a small back with poor tested athleticism who didn't get drafted early and plays for a team in the Bucs where you have some questions about leaning into them. But this year, the Bucs have been the perfect team to be on from a running back perspective. You and I were joking before the show that he wasn't the first Buccaneers running back to be the overall RB1 for a week. Sean Tucker had actually done that in week 6. Rachaad White was the overall RB2 in week 9, where he was just behind Jahmyr Gibbs and just ahead of Saquon Barkley. Irving actually hasn't completely sustained it through the stretch from a snaps perspective, but just in terms of finding the really favorable span to talk about, Irving did have a snaps spike in week 6. And from that point, he's averaged 18.5 points per game, which is just ahead of Derrick Henry. I mean, that feels so weird to say. And granted, yes, this team has been very good for the running backs, but Irving has been brilliant. His evasion rate, 22%, is more than double Saquon Barkley's. He's averaging 3.5 yards after contact per attempt. Barkley is at 3. Now, I do have all the necessary caveats in the article about that doesn't make Irving better. Irving is slow, which you did see on the long run, although partly he also just appeared to be dragging his hip, which is one of the things we're concerned about going forward. Barkley is very, very fast. Barkley gets those big plays that end in the end zone instead of inside the 10, what have you. But the Buccaneers have done a fantastic job this season at creating those high value touches that you were talking about. And in terms of how that translates directly into scoring, the Bucs are number 2 for running back scoring behind the Detroit Lions. That's 2.3 more than Derrick Henry's Ravens, 3.9 more than Barkley's Eagles, 4.2 more than Achane's Dolphins. It's a touchdown more than Bijan Robinson's Falcons, 7 more than Josh Jacobs' Patriots, 7.1 more than Joe Mixon's Texans. When you think about all of these situations where backs are having very big years and the Bucs as a team are outdoing them. So certainly if that gets more concentrated on Irving, it could be very, very positive. The Bucs also, again, this kind of gets back to that high value touch thing. How does that look in fantasy points? They're 3rd in receiving EP per game behind only the Dolphins and Alvin Kamara's Saints. They're also number 1 in FPOE in that category. And so one of the things we've given Rachaad White credit for is he actually is still good as a receiver. He and Bucky have been very good there. They've been more effective, and not just marginally so, but more effective than Achane in the receiving game. And Achane has been extraordinary. They've been better than the Bills, where those backs have been fantastic on a per play basis or on a per game basis in the receiving game. They've been better than what Justice Hill has done for the Ravens. And we've talked about what Hill has been as a receiving back and how every once in a while he has the spike weeks because he is their receiving back. They sometimes get into game contexts, and then he's just been so good. It's exciting because anytime that you look at someone like a Bucky Irving and just even the rest of these guys, if they would get a chance, if the offense is very favorable for it, and then you have someone playing extremely well, like Bucky Irving, it generally doesn't do what we're getting from Kenneth Walker. You generally get the big games that Bucky is now putting up for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and for his fantasy managers.
3+ receptions in 6 straight games, only had 3 one time in his first 6 games of his career. They've been using him with more intent and in the passing game, as we've talked through after he showed his worth as a runner. It's just made sense to keep him on the field in every way, in every form, and get him the ball. The receiving stuff, in addition to now, just massive rushing volume and workload. The hip injury will be something to monitor. You said you're maybe a little concerned about it. What I have seen suggests that it's maybe he'll be okay this week. So it was something to keep an eye on, is all I'm saying. We don't know. Obviously, we're recording this on Wednesday morning. Something to keep an eye on. If he does miss, then you're going to have the potential for maybe Sean Tucker to have a good game. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. But Bucky has been fantastic. What are we going to say?
And Tucker is a tricky one from a waivers perspective, because in many cases you're not going to have a roster spot. And you got to see what he did last week, which was nothing. But
he's more of a cut, than an ad right now.
He's still so explosive in a backfield that creates value. But the flip side of that has been a player that we weren't particularly high on. And I don't think this is, trying to justify that so much as just describing how the season is going. The hardest player that I left out of my first 2 rounds in that 2025 redraft ranking exercise was Alvin Kamara. And it's hard to leave out simply because the scoring level is so high. If you're going to leave someone out with that kind of scoring level, it's going to raise some eyebrows, right? But Kamara is somewhat doing what he had done before, which is that he's having a season with poor rushing peripherals. And week 13 was the same way. 22 carries, his 17% bust rate, which again is just, a handful of busts, but is the worst among backs with double-digit carries, 0% boom rate. The problem there is that the receiving production or the receiving efficiency is also sliding. He had this big spike game in week 2 against the Dallas Cowboys where they didn't look like they were playing with the right number of players on the field. He has 10 receiving fantasy points over expected in that game. The first 3 weeks, very strong. Since then, he has more or less fallen off a cliff to the point where he's now even in receiving FPOE on the season. You wouldn't have thought that was possible with such a big lead that he had banked over those first 3 weeks. Then, since the onset of week 3, his total negative fantasy points over expected of -28. The only person who's accumulated more negative is Kareem Hunt. So, we have to continue to give Kamara credit for being a hybrid back, for being someone who has created a little bit of a moat for himself because of his past performance, because he does occasionally make some wow plays, and because he is such a good receiver. But a lot of his future production is going to be heavily reliant on maintaining a moat when his own production has some pretty serious warts. The Kendra Miller thing is always a bit of an issue since there's a lack of professionalism there. But as we think through what's going to happen going forward, you have the Taysom Hill injury. That should be very positive for Kamara rest of season. At the same time, the Saints are heading into an offseason where everything is going to have to start fresh. And one of those things would seem to be a backfield that has a further injection of talent. Although maybe not. There are teams like the Dallas Cowboys and Kansas City Chiefs that went into the season with Super Bowl aspirations and didn't feel like they needed to address that. A team like the Saints may feel like that's the last thing on their laundry list. This Saints team here, Derek Carr continues to make a lot of impressive throws to limit mistakes, and yet that is not translating into, number one, passing yards. You talked about that 200-yard level. He doesn't get there despite throwing 37 passes. This is a game in which he throws it 37 times, doesn't throw a pick, doesn't take a sack. The Saints also don't score a lot of points and they lose.
I wrote up for Signals readers this week, Shawn, that I was a little bit concerned about Kamara the rest of the season. You were kind of talking through some of the different things. 265 touches to this point in the season. His career high is only 287. He's never had a 300 touch season. He opened his career with 8 straight 200 touch seasons, including this year. 7 straight 250 plus touch seasons, starting from a second season. So he's been in this range a bunch of times, but we've only played 11 games.
There's a lot of work to be done yet.
There's a lot of work to be done yet. He's on his way. I mean, if he has 22 touches this week, which you would think with Taysom Hill out, he's going to, he'll be tied with his, he might go ahead of his career high this week in his 13th game. Kendre Miller's back this week. Look, Kendre Miller, no one likes Kendre Miller in the New Orleans organization. He's never going to get an opportunity. He's never going to play. Don't listen to me. You would think, despite all the things that have happened, and their interim coach has talked about Kendre Miller and said that he met with him and told him that his complete fresh slate, he gets to dictate his own future. The reality is Kendre Miller may not be interested in dictating his own future. We don't really know, but all the signs.
I've met with some people in sporting contests before and told them that they could dictate their own future because they hadn't dictated their past very well. And past behavior was a pretty strong indicator of future behavior.
Right. There you go. I think what everyone is sort of anticipating here. Having said that, if he had a come to Jesus moment or something in the last few weeks, they would, I think, be strongly benefited in a 4-8 season right now from getting him some work in the last month. We've been saying this the whole year with Kendre Miller. He had a nice week 18 last year. They gave him a bunch of work at the end of last season. Different coaching staff. Obviously, it's all new now. You would think that there would be some possibility that Kendre Miller could actually earn some more work if he's up for it. I don't know if that'll start this week. I'm intrigued to see what happens this week because he is eligible to be activated off IR. The other thing the interim coach, Darren Rizzi, said was something like, I was probably ahead of myself acting like we were going to jump, throw him out there and use him a bunch. He had some kind of pullback comment where it was like, don't expect too much. And again, that probably is based on Kendre Miller's actions in practice and stuff, right? He's like, wait, I can see why Dennis Allen didn't like him. I'm just saying. Alvin Kamara is close to a career high in touches. Taysom Hill's out for the year. Jamal Williams returned this week and played 4 snaps. They don't think they're going to give Jamal Williams a bunch of work the rest of the way. Kamara, I don't think is really going for anything. He's over 1,300 yards. His career high is over 16, almost 1,700 yards. He can maybe push that career high, but also because of all the other good players, it's not like he's going for Offensive Player of the Year or any of those types of awards. He's not the top running back in the NFL. He's never rushed for 1,000 yards. His career high is 932. He's been over 884 times, but never got over 1,000. He's at 894 right now. Probably 2 more games worth of work he's going to get there. My point is, it would just be, he's at this career high in yards per game, rushing yards per game for him by 5, like a strong 74.5. He had never previously had more than 70 rush yards per game. He's only been above 60 twice. He's mostly been like a 50 to 59 yards per game guy on the ground. And then he adds all the receiving as well, obviously. My point is, maybe he wants to have 1,000-yard rushing season. Maybe that'll be a goal for him. We'll see the way they go with it. I guess I'd be surprised, Shawn, in their final 5 games if he has 20-plus touches, like an average of that the rest of the way, and they get him all the way to like 350 touches. Why would they do that? It'd be shocking to me, actually. But
I think they would do it because coaches need to win the game that's ahead of them, and they are not maybe as tuned into or concerned about what it's going to mean for some of the things that you are referencing there. But it is something to keep an eye on. Alvin Kamara, obviously a very good fantasy play right now, but he could be, he needs to have that receiving work. They're not going to get down there in the red zone that often. This was a game where he drew 6 targets, gained 7 yards. That's not going to get it done. Then we wanted to finish up. We've already talked about the Chiefs side of Chiefs Raiders in the first show, but Aiden O'Connell averages almost 10 yards per attempt on his 35 passes. He doesn't throw a pick. He does take 3 sacks. We know what that meant for Brock Bowers. We know how hot Jacoby Myers has been running, but there were some under the radar elements at running back, which, depending on the news between now and when you're listening to this show, could be more relevant than it seems like, especially in deep formats, but for any case where someone is trying to deal with a bye week issue or simply has depth that they want to build, or maybe an injury to cover for.
Yeah, I've been pretty excited about Sincere McCormick over the last couple of weeks. They mentioned during the game that, one of those in our production meeting, they told us they want to get him more work this week. He only had a 10% snap share in week 12 when he was first activated that first game when both Zamir White and Alexander Mattison were out. And Amir Abdullah played 90% of the snaps, but in those 10% of the snaps, he had a few carries and he was pretty effective. And so they wanted to get him more work. Last week, he does get more work and looks good again, sort of as the game goes along. So in week 12, he had 5 carries, 33 yards, 6.6 yards per carry. That's all he did in the very limited usage that I mentioned, the 10% snap share. Last week, he's all the way up to, which was eight offensive snaps. 5 carries on 8 offensive snaps. Last week, he's all the way up to 38% snap share in a game that had reasonable play volume. He had 26 offensive snaps, and he gets 12 carries and 2 receptions on those. So again, a pretty high rate of touches per snap, which I think is notable. You get 14 touches on 26 snaps, more than half of his snaps that he was out there, he touched the ball. Amir Abdullah only gets 12 touches in this game, 10 carries, 2 receptions. He ran, I think, something like 60% routes, and McCormick was at like 18% routes. And yet McCormick matched him with the 2 catches, because when McCormick ran those routes, they were throwing to him with intent as well, right? So it's basically like a little screen or an intentional dump off or something. He catches 2 balls. He doesn't do a lot on those 2 catches, only 1 receiving yard, but 64 rushing yards on the 12 carries, 5.3 yards per carry. Again, an effective rushing game from him. So now has 17 carries over the last 2 weeks, 97 yards, 5.7 yards per carry. It's an interesting situation. There have been these guys in fantasy history. I referenced to you prior to the show this guy named Nick Goings, who was always a favorite of mine. I had him in 2004 when he had this stretch of massive scoring. I've talked about him on the show. People will remember the name. One of my early year favorite fantasy running backs. I mentioned Peyton Hillis' name to you as well a little bit ago. He did it for like a whole season. But you get these guys that maybe we weren't expecting to be the guy, but also the situations, I feel like, are ones where the team isn't necessarily going anywhere. There's not a lot to be excited about, but the team then finds something that's a little bit exciting and wants to lean into that, because what else are they coaching for and playing for at this point? I mean, honestly, with the Raiders, their offense also, by the way, very thin when you look at the full skill position. Like we talk about the sort of usage tree or who the focal points of the offense are. It's one of those situations as well. Like when I think about the Nick Goings stuff, the Peyton Hillis things, it's like they didn't have a lot of stars at other positions. This team obviously does have Brock Bowers, which is massive. And then they have Jacoby Myers, who I wrote, very exciting to see him get 11 targets in a game where Bowers did what Bowers did, 14 targets and 10 catches. He gets 11 targets behind that. No one else on the team had more than 2 targets. So Jacoby Myers consolidated all of the secondary work, which is an exciting thing. Trey Tucker had a 58-yard TD catch on his only target. You see a couple other guys get a little bit of volume here and there, but for the most part, this is Bowers, and then it's Jacoby Myers, and then it's nothing. And they've been trying to do stuff at running back, not finding any answers. They fired Luke Getsy the very next game with the Turners taking over as the offensive coordinators. They used Zamir White the whole first half of that game, and it was like this tacit admission that, well, Alexander Madison's not the answer, so we're going to go back to Zamir White. That's our fix as the new coordinators. Well, guess what? They got about half a game, and they're like, well, we can't really use Zamir White anymore, and he's been banged up as well since then. Madison looked better in that game, but then he gets hurt. But also you have them trying to earn, really probably the younger Scott Turner trying to earn potentially a future offensive coordinator gig. And you want to stick with the stuff that's working. So we'll see what happens with McCormick. He's only at 38% snaps. What I was telling people over on the Signal side was that if we see him jump again this week, then you'll, I think, be able to potentially use him You might be willing to consider him if you're in a real desperate situation with the week 14 bye week stuff, but especially week 15, 16, 17, I think there's the possibility that he's getting like 20 touches, right? I mentioned he had 14 touches on only a 38% snap share. If he gets up to like 50 or 60% of the snaps, he probably won't play every down. Abdullah will still play the obvious pass downs. If Madison's back, I'm sure he'll play too. But I think there are scenarios where even if Madison's back or Zamir White's back, that McCormick is just playing ahead of them, basically, is the idea. That they have not been comfortable with any of their running backs to this point. And it's a situation like that where somebody can come from nowhere, show a little bit of a burst, show a little bit of excitement, and then they're like, well, we're going to use you, and we're going to use you a lot. The reason he got 14 touches on 26 snaps is, again, it's Bowers and Jacoby Myers and not a lot else in this offense. He might become that third focal point of the offense. I mean, I think that's at least a plausible outcome. As we were talking through it, you pulled up his schedule the rest of the way. It's the best running back schedule by the RotoViz matchup strength of schedule streamer, fantasy matchup streamer app. It's had a couple different names. So
you'll be able to find it if you. One of the things, Ben, too, that you had referenced to me before the show that I really like guys who have stuck in the NFL, really like guys who had production before they had to embark on that long path to stick. McCormick was a workhorse back, and this is a long time ago again, but it's cool that he's stuck around. Back 2019 to 2021 with UT San Antonio, really high running back dominator ratings. Those are not necessarily predictive overall, but they are a helpful stat to find these deep sleepers. He's somebody who rushed for over 1,400 yards with double-digit rushing touchdowns in back-to-back seasons. He's someone who in all three of those years caught 20-plus passes. You start to layer in some of those things, and it goes from being, like a super, 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 super dark horse, unlikely outcome to one that's still unlikely. But the pieces, as you said, are in place.
Yeah, they're in place for something unexpected, and that's the important part. I got asked as I was talking about it for him relative to like Isaac Guerendo, and I was like, no, Isaac Guerendo is like the ad this week where you burn your whole waiver budget, and people listening to this will have already had their waivers go, and he'll have already been added. But McCormick in a lot of these leagues won't even been picked up, and so the point is he might be flying under the radar this week. If you missed out on Guerendo, if you're looking for something, you don't have a start this week because of buys like we were talking about. Again, this guy got 14 touches last week in a role that might expand. Is sort of now the other scenario you mentioned. They're as they're listening to this, they might have more information. Other scenario is the other running backs might be back and healthy, and his snap share might go down. That is possible. I don't think likely because usually teams like this do lean into the guy that's the hot hand a little bit, but it's possible he actually loses work this coming week. One other little note that I had mentioned to you before we jumped on is we saw today, we're recording this Wednesday morning, that he got signed officially from the practice squad to the active roster. It's a pretty early week move. So what they've been doing the last 2 weeks is just elevating him on game day from the practice squad. But when you are on the practice squad, another team can sign you off the practice squad. This happened to the Chiefs were with their kicker, right? Somebody signed him off their practice squad, like right before game day. They were going to elevate him again. And so they had to sign a new kicker. They had that Schrader guy. The Jets signed him. Now they have Matthew Wright or whatever kicking field goals for him. You just leave a guy on the practice squad. Another team can just go sign him if he's willing to be taken off of your practice squad and get signed to another active roster. The Raiders were clearly concerned about that. And it may also be an indication that they're not expecting Madison and or White back. Early in the week, they signed McCormick officially. They could have elevated him again this week. They signed him officially to the active roster. It would not be likely that both Madison and White would be back this week and he would be like deactivated once they made that move. I mean, I think he's at least going to be active and be maybe one of Madison or White's back or something, but in all likelihood, McCormick will be active this week. And like I said, 14 touches last week and was good. He's been 5+ yards per carry in the both games that he's played. He's not done nothing but show positive things, and they need players that are doing that. They have so few. It's at least worth kicking the tires on, picking up, seeing what happens.
Well, I will be rooting for Sincere McCormick going forward. I think that the thesis there is certainly fun. We would love to see an underdog come through. We've had really a handful of zero RB guys still push in, make their incursions into this just running back across the board 2024 season. We still could have underdogs who end up being the definitive pieces down the stretch. That'll do it for this episode of Stealing Bananas. Good luck in your huge week 14 matchups. We're rooting for you guys there. I'm Shawn Siegele. You can, well, I guess I usually save this. I'm at RotoViz, coupon code RBRadio2024 at checkout. Ben can be followed at Yards Per Gretch at just his name on Blue Sky. So if you know Ben's name, you'll be able to find him over there. Stealing signals, stealing lines, subscribe to his YouTube, all of those fun things. Leave us a rating and review for the show. It really helps us as we go down the stretch here and try to build the audience, bring you more content. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.